Good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Lager, and I'll be teaching this 6-week class on preaching. And great difficulties. Where do you start? I mean, it's a big subject. Where do you begin when you talk about preaching? And I've got here some of the sermon books that are supposed to teach how to preach that I've collected. One's from Clarence Macartney, a great preacher from Pittsburgh. Dennis Kinlaw, Preaching in the Spirit. Paul Rees, Stir Up the Gift. Faith to Proclaim, James S. Stewart, not the actor, great Scottish preacher. Thomas Long, Literary Forms of the Bible, How to Preach Those. Jeffrey Arthurs, professor at Gordon Conwell, preacher. Communicating for a Change, Andy Stanley. I haven't read it yet. Brian Chappell, have read this one. Christ-Centered Preaching, good book. Doctrine That Dances, Robert Smith, great African-American preacher. Jerry Vines, Power in the Pulpit. That's actually a really good book to read. Hear things in there you wouldn't hear maybe other places. Charlie Kohler, Expository Preaching Without Notes. Dwayne Lifton, seminary president, wrote a book on public speaking, but very applicable to preaching. Handful of Stars. Gerald Marvel, one of the great Church of God preachers, along with Maurice Berquist, also a great preacher in his own right. There's a lot of different books on preaching. There's a lot of different theories on how a sermon should develop. And I think to a large part, all of those are valid. But for our purposes, we have 6 weeks, and I'd like to work through Haddon Robinson's book on biblical preaching. Haddon Robinson wrote this book. At the second edition, there were over 200,000 in print, and actually there's more farther editions, and so I think it sold at least 300,000 or 400,000 copies. It is the single most used book on how to develop sermons. And so in our 6 weeks, I'd like to look at his theory, his philosophy to develop a sermon outline, starting at the outline, going to the finished manuscript. There won't be any preaching, so don't worry about having to record videos of yourself preaching. We're not going to do that. But we are going to start and sort of work through how a sermon develops from beginning to end. So you've got a passage. You've looked at this biblical passage. The Holy Spirit is directing you to speak on the content of that passage. How do you get from knowing the Holy Spirit wants you to talk about what is involved in Romans chapter 4, and how do you bring that to a main ideal, to a general outline, to a specific outline, and then get it into a manuscript form? Haddon Robinson has some great ideals on how to do that. He had a great, really a great scheme on how to get from the text to the manuscript. And we'd like to work through that. So we'll start, and we'll start by talking about getting it to the ideal, and then we'll talk about generally outlining the text. We'll talk about introductions and conclusions, and then sort of putting meat on the skeleton we've created. And by the end of the class, you should have a couple of really good sermons that are in preachable form. You ought to have a few other outlines that don't need much work to get into preachable form. So I think if you can have at least one fallback way to get a text into manuscript form, I think that will be worth your time. Again, there are other ways to preach, but it's always good to have at least one way that you know really well, because oftentimes, again, a passage is very hard to unpack. It's at least early in preaching, it's easy to come to a text and to say, wow, this is great, this is inspired, The people that I'm going to be speaking to really need to hear this. But I mean, how do I take it and organize it and get it into a 30 or 40-minute sermon? And that can be complicated and it can be frustrating. And that's what I'd like to help you with in our time together. So we hope that it's productive, and we hope that you learn something in the weeks to come. God bless you. Glad that you're taking this class.